Imagine standing at the edge of the world, not at the edge of a continent, not at the shore of an ocean, but at the literal edge of existence itself. Below you, nothing. Not darkness, not water, nothing. The formless, churning chaos that existed before reality was real. And in your hands, a jeweled spear so long its tip disappears into the void below. You have been given one instruction by the gods who sent you here. One instruction that the entire future of the universe depends on. Stir the chaos. See what rises. That is exactly where this story begins. Not in a temple, not in a palace, not in the pages of a sacred text, but on a bridge made of clouds and light, suspended between heaven and nothing, held in place by nothing but divine will, and the decision of two gods who had never done anything before, because nothing had been done before. Because there was no before. There was only the bridge, the spear, and the silence of a universe that had not yet decided to exist. This is the story of Ama-no-Ukihashi, the floating bridge of heaven. The most important bridge ever built, in any mythology, in any culture, in any civilization. A bridge that was never meant for humans. A bridge that connected the realm of the gods to the churning ocean of chaos below. And the two divine beings who stood on it, Izanagi and Izanami, the he who invites and the she who invites, who stirred the void with a jeweled spear and created an island from the drops that fell. If you lived in ancient Japan and you wanted to understand why the islands of your country existed, why the mountains rose and the rivers ran, why the sun rose every morning and the storm came every season, this bridge was your answer. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. The actual mechanism of creation. The device through which the gods built the world. And what happened on that bridge, what was spoken, what was done, what was broken, and what was repaired, shaped Japanese civilization, Japanese religion, and the Japanese understanding of life and death for over 2,000 years. Before there was history, there were legends. And this is the bridge between heaven and earth, the bridge that built Japan. If you had been alive in ancient Japan in the period before writing, before cities, before the great imperial dynasties that would organize the islands into a single nation, and someone asked you where Japan came from, your answer would not have been geological. You would not have spoken about tectonic plates or volcanic activity, or the slow emergence of land from the sea. You would have told this story. Not as mythology in the modern sense, not as a story you know is fiction, but tell anyway for its beauty. As fact. As the most fundamental fact of your world. The Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, the two great chronicles of ancient Japan, compiled in the early 8th century from oral traditions that stretched back centuries before writing open with this story. Not with a king, not with a battle, not with a hero. They open with a bridge.
A floating bridge suspended in the void between heaven and the churning primordial ocean. And on this bridge, two gods receiving the most important instruction ever given, make the land. The high-value insight that unlocks the entire Japanese mythological tradition is this. Unlike most creation myths, the Japanese creation does not begin with a god speaking the world into existence from a position of absolute power.
It begins with two young, relatively inexperienced divine beings standing on a bridge above nothing, holding a spear they have never used before, trying to figure out how to do something that has never been done. The Japanese creation myth is, at its heart, a story about learning, about attempting something without knowing if it will work, about the terrifying freedom of being the first. Izanagi and Izanami were not the first gods in the Japanese cosmos. Before them, the primordial deities had already emerged from the void, appearing spontaneously as the universe began to differentiate itself from chaos. But those first gods were distant, abstract, cosmic forces that existed without acting. They were the conditions that made creation possible, not the beings who performed it. Izanagi and Izanami were different. They were the first gods with bodies, the first gods with gender. The first gods sent downward from the heavens with a specific task: complete the work of creation. Make the earth solid, make it real. The bridge Ama-no-Ukihashi was their starting point and their platform, translated literally as the floating bridge of heaven. It existed in the space between the ordered realm of the gods above and the disordered ocean of chaos below. Standing on it meant standing at the exact boundary between what was and what could be. And when the divine couple leaned over the edge of the bridge and lowered the jeweled spear, the Ame-no-Nuboko, into the churning brine below, they were not casting a fishing line. They were writing the first line of the physical world. But as we look more closely at the bridge itself, at what it was made of, where it came from, and why it was positioned exactly where it was, we find a detail that the standard translations always pass over. A detail about the bridge's true purpose that suggests Izanagi and Izanami were not the first divine beings to stand on it. And whoever stood there before them left something behind. Something encoded in the structure of the bridge itself that determined not just how Japan was created, but why it was created the way it was. Before you can understand what happened on the floating bridge, you need to understand who was standing on it. Izanagi and Izanami are among the most psychologically complex divine couples in world mythology, not because they are perfect or all-powerful, but because they are profoundly, recognizably human in their imperfections. They make mistakes, they feel grief, they break the rules, they argue, and the consequences of their relationship, their creation, their separation, and the terrible thing that happened between them in the darkness of the underworld are still visible in the world today, if you know where to look. Their names tell you everything essential about their natures. Izanagi means he who invites, the masculine divine principle of invitation, summoning, calling forth. Izanami means she who invites, the feminine divine principle of the same action. They are not opposites, they are mirrors. Two expressions of the same essential cosmic function. The act of drawing existence out of non-existence, of inviting reality to become more real. This is not the masculine active versus feminine, passive dynamic of some other mythologies. Both are inviters, both are creators. The imbalance that eventually develops between them is not structural, it is chosen, and it is tragic. In the physical descriptions preserved in the ancient chronicles, Izanagi is typically depicted as a tall, luminous figure in white robes carrying the divine jeweled spear, the Ame-no-Nuboko. Izanami stands beside him with the same luminosity, her robe described with the specific blue-black of deep ocean water before sunrise. Together, they are the visual embodiment of the bridge they stand on the boundary between light and darkness, between the ordered and the unordered, between what the gods above have decided and what the world below has not yet become. What makes them remarkable in the context of world mythology is their commission. They were not self-appointed creators acting on personal ambition. They were sent. The heavenly assembly of older gods, the Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, looked down at the world below and saw that it was not yet solidified, drifting like oil on water. And the assembly chose Izanagi and Izanami specifically, gave them the jeweled spear specifically, and gave them a specific instruction: consolidate the drifting land, make it solid, then return. The high-value detail here is the word consolidate. In the original Japanese cosmological framework, the material for the world already existed. It was just disordered. The primordial ocean was not empty. It was full of potential reality that had not yet been organized into form. Izanagi and Izanami were not creating from nothing. They were organizing. They were editors of chaos. And the spear they were given, the Ame-no-Nuboko, adorned with jewels that caught the light of heaven, was not a weapon, but an instrument of divine organization, a cosmic tool for separating what should be solid from what should remain fluid. But in the oldest versions of this story, the ones preserved not in the imperial chronicles, but in the regional traditions of specific Japanese provinces, there is a version of Izanami's character that the official Kojiki deliberately softened. a version in which she is not the equal partner of Izanagi, but something older and more powerful. Something that the Heavenly Assembly was not entirely comfortable with. Something that explains why, when the tragedy finally came, it came from her side of the divine pair, and why the world has been divided between life and death ever since. Here is the moment that almost ended everything before it began. Izanagi and Izanami are standing on the floating bridge of heaven for the first time. They have the spear. They have their instructions. Below them, the primordial ocean churns in formless chaos, and they do not know how to begin. This moment, the moment of creative paralysis before the first act of creation, is one of the most honest and human moments in all of world mythology. The gods themselves, faced with the blank canvas of existence, hesitated. What broke the paralysis was the spear. Acting on divine instinct, or perhaps on something encoded in the spear itself, Izanagi lowered the Ama-no-Ukihashi into the churning brine below the bridge and stirred. The sound it made described in the Kojiki with the onomatopoeia koro koro. A deep, resonant, churning sound was the first sound in the history of the world. Not thunder, not wind, not a divine voice, a stirring sound. The sound of chaos being organized. And when Izanagi lifted the spear back up, the drops that fell from its tip solidified in the air and landed, accumulating, becoming the first island. Onogoroshima, the self-forming island, the first solid ground in the history of Japan. From this island, Izanagi and Izanami descended from the bridge and began their work in earnest. They erected the august pillar of heaven, the Ama-no-Ukihashi, a cosmic column that connected the island to the bridge above and the ocean below, the axis of the world, the still point around which everything would turn. And then they performed the first ritual of creation, a sacred circumambulation of the pillar, walking in opposite directions, and meeting on the other side to speak the words of divine union. This is where the first mistake happened, and it was Izanami who spoke first. In the sacred ceremony of circumambulation, the male principal was supposed to speak first to initiate the divine invitation that would activate creation. But Izanami, moved by joy or eagerness or the specific energy of the divine feminine that moves before it waits for permission, spoke first. "Oh, what a fine and handsome youth." And Izanagi responded, "Oh, what a lovely and gracious maiden." The words were right. The ceremony was performed, but the order was wrong. The children born from this first incorrect union were imperfect. The first was Hiruko, leech child, a boneless, formless creature that could not stand or walk. The second was Awashima, foam island, insubstantial and unstable. Neither child was counted among the proper islands of Japan. Both were placed in boats and sent out to sea, one of the most haunting images in all of Japanese mythology. The gods' first children, their first mistakes, floating away into the ocean on the morning of the world. But the leech child, Hiruko, did not simply disappear. The regional traditions of coastal Japan preserve a legend about where Hiruko's boat eventually landed and what the child became after washing ashore. The being that emerged from that boat centuries later became one of the most venerated gods in the entire Japanese pantheon, a god of fortune, of the sea, of the unexpected gift that arrives from nowhere. Which means that what the Heavenly Assembly called a failure, the world eventually recognized as something else entirely. And this raises a question that the Kojiki never answers directly. Were Izanagi and Izanami's early mistakes actually failures? Or were they a different kind of creation, one the gods hadn't planned, but the world needed anyway? After consulting with the Heavenly Assembly and correcting the order of their sacred ceremony, Izanagi and Izanami returned to the task of creation with renewed precision. What followed was one of the most extraordinary passages in world mythology, a systematic, almost architectural account of the creation of the Japanese archipelago, island by island, each one born not from geological process, but from divine intention. If you are Japanese and you read the Kojiki's account of the island's creation, You are reading the birth record of your homeland. The great island of Awaji came first a long, narrow strip of land that the ancient Japanese considered the most fundamental, the cornerstone of the archipelago. Then, Shikoku, the four-faced island, its four provinces corresponding to four divine names spoken simultaneously during its creation. Then Oki, the hidden island in the sea. Then Kyushu, the island of 9 provinces, created with a specific divine energy that the chronicles describe as abundant and fertile. Then the islands of Tsushima and Iki, the sentinels of the strait between Japan and the continent. Then Sado, the exile island, created with a quality of isolation written into its very nature. And finally, last and most important, Yamato, the great central island, the heart of what would become Japan. Each island was not simply shaped and placed. Each island was named. In the Japanese cosmological tradition, naming is not labeling, it is completing. An unnamed thing is not fully real. An unnamed island is still partly chaos. The act of Izanagi and Izanami, naming each island as it emerged from the sea, was the final act of creation, the moment when potential became actual, when the possible became the physical. The names they gave were not descriptive labels, but divine identities, the essential natures of the places encoded in sound from the moment of their creation. After the islands came the gods. Izanagi and Izanami, having completed the physical structure of the world, turned to populating it with the divine forces that would govern each aspect of reality. They gave birth to the gods of wind, of sea, of mountain, of river, of tree, of plains, of fire, of mist, of autumn, of spring. Each divine birth was an act of world-building. Each new god represented a new domain of reality coming into existence. The wind did not exist until the god of wind was born. The mountain did not have its character until the god of mountain came into being. The world was not just made, it was progressively animated, each element receiving its governing divine principle as it was created. But as the births continued, dozens of divine children, each one a new dimension of the physical world, the creation process was building toward a catastrophe that Izanagi and Izanami could not have foreseen and could not prevent. Because the last child, the child that would complete the creation of the physical world, was also the child that would break the divine couple apart forever. And the nature of that child, and what his birth cost, is the moment where the Japanese creation myth transforms from a story about the world being made into a story about the world learning what death is. His name was Kagutsuchi, the god of fire, and his birth killed his mother. This is the central tragedy of the Japanese creation myth, the event that divides the story into a before and after, the moment when the perfect creative partnership of Izanagi and Izanami shattered, when death entered the world for the first time, and when the relationship between the living and the dead became the defining wound in the Japanese cosmological imagination. Izanami gave birth to Kagutsuchi, the fire deity, the god of flame and heat and the energy that makes metal workable and food edible and darkness livable, and in doing so, her body was consumed by his fire. The divine chronicles describe her suffering in specific and deeply human terms. She fell ill, she burned from within, she lay on the ground of the island she had helped to create and died while her husband watched, unable to help, unable to reverse what the very act of creation had brought into being. From her vomit, her urine, her feces, the gods of ore and clay and water were born in her final moments, as if her body was releasing its remaining creative energy before it stopped. Izanagi's response to Izanami's death was not divine acceptance, it was human grief. He held her body and wept, and from his tears a goddess was born, the goddess of crying, of mourning, of the specific quality of sorrow that does not know what to do with itself. He named the places where different parts of his grief fell, encoding his loss into the geography of the islands. And then, in a moment of divine rage that the ancient chronicles record without judgment, he drew his sword and cut Kagutsuchi, his own son, the god of fire, into 8 pieces. From those 8 pieces, 8 new mountain gods were born, their fire natures transformed by the violence of their creation into the volcanic peaks of the Japanese landscape. But killing Kagutsuchi did not bring Izanami back. She had gone to Yomi, the underworld, the land of the dead, the place beneath the roots of the world where the dead go when they leave the living. And Izanagi, unable to accept her absence, made a decision that no god before him had ever made, and that the underworld had never been asked to accommodate. He decided to go after her, to descend into Yomi, to find his wife in the darkness and bring her back. This decision, this refusal to accept death as final, this insistence that love could override the cosmic division between the living and the dead, is the emotional engine of the entire second half of the Japanese creation myth. It is also, in the most profound theological sense, the origin of every Japanese ritual connected to death, purification, and the careful maintenance of the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead. What Izanagi did in Yomi, and what he saw there, and what he brought back with him when he fled this, is the event that made the world what it is. But before we descend into Yomi with Izanagi, there is a detail about Kagutsuchi's death that the mainstream translations consistently underemphasize. The 8 mountain gods born from his body were not random creations. They were specific. Each one governed a specific type of volcanic or geological phenomenon. And the Japanese tradition holds that these 8 gods are still active, that every volcanic eruption, every earthquake, every emergence of new land from the sea is Kagutsuchi's dismembered body still trying to reassemble itself. Which means the fire god is not dead. He is distributed, and the geography of Japan is his ongoing attempt at resurrection. If you lived in ancient Japan and you wanted to understand why death is permanent, why the dead cannot return to the living, why certain places and objects and actions require purification before they can be brought back into contact with the living world, this is the story you would be told, not as theology, as explanation, as the specific sequence of events that created the rules you live by, the rituals you perform, the boundaries you do not cross. Yomi, the Japanese underworld, is unlike the underworlds of other mythologies. It is not a place of punishment or reward. It is not organized or governed by a divine judge. It is a place of darkness and corruption, a place where things that were once alive become something else, a place defined entirely by what it is not light, not warmth, not the world of the living. The Japanese concept of death is not primarily about what the dead experience, it is about what the dead become. And what they become is the source of the most fundamental category of Japanese ritual impurity. Izanagi entered Yomi through one of the caves at the edge of the islands, the thin places where the membrane between the living world and the dead world is closest to breaking. He called out for Izanami in the darkness, and she answered. Her voice, recognizable as the voice of his wife, came to him through the darkness, but she told him not to come closer. She told him she had already eaten the food of Yomi, that she was already part of this place, that there might still be a way to negotiate with the gods of the underworld, but that he must wait, and he must not look at her. Izanagi waited. The darkness was total, the silence broken only by sounds he could not identify. And then, in the moment that mirrors every myth of impossible conditions and inevitable human failure, from Orpheus to Lot's wife, he could not wait any longer. He broke off one of the teeth of his comb, lit it as a torch, and looked. What he saw in the light of that small flame was his wife, but not his wife as he had known her. Izanami's body, in the time she had spent in Yomi, had become a rotting thing, crawling with maggots and decay, the divine beauty of creation transformed by death into something that belonged completely to the underworld. He ran. Izanami transformed, furious, humiliated by being seen in her death state, sent the hags of Yomi to chase him. Then the armies of the underworld, then her own children, the thunder gods born from the rot of her body. Izanagi fled through the darkness of Yomi with all the forces of death behind him, throwing objects over his shoulder that transformed into obstacles. His headdress became grapes that the hags stopped to eat. His comb became bamboo shoots. Peaches he carried became a barrier against the thunder gods. And then he reached the boundary. The flat slope at the edge of Yomi, the place where the underworld meets the living world, where the membrane between the two realms is thin enough to push through. And Izanami herself came to the boundary, no longer his wife, now the goddess of death, now the ruler of Yomi, and she called across the threshold to him. What she said in that moment, and what he answered, and the object he placed between them to seal the division between the living and the dead forever, this exchange is the founding document of the Japanese understanding of mortality. And it ends with a promise that the world has been keeping ever since. At the boundary of Yomi, at the place where the underworld opens onto the living world, where the cold darkness of death is separated from the warmth of life by nothing but a threshold, Izanagi and Izanami face each other for the last time, not as husband and wife, not as co-creators of the world, as representatives of two realms that can no longer coexist, as the personification of the divide that death creates between those who have crossed it and those who have not. Izanami spoke first. Her voice, coming from the darkness of Yomi, carried the specific quality that the Japanese tradition associates with the dead, speaking to the living, recognizable but changed, familiar but wrong in some frequency that the body recognizes before the mind does. She told him, "If you do this, if you leave and seal this boundary, I will kill 1,000 people every day." The threat was not personal, it was cosmological. She was not threatening him specifically. She was announcing the terms of the new reality. Death would be permanent, and it would be relentless, and it would take 1,000 lives every day from the world of the living. Izanagi's response was immediate and equally cosmic. "If you do that, I will cause 1,500 people to be born every day." The exchange death claiming 1,000, life producing 1,500, is the founding formula of the Japanese demographic cosmos. It is the origin of the surplus of birth over death that allows civilization to persist, to grow, that makes the future possible despite the certainty of individual mortality. In this single exchange at the threshold of the underworld, the Japanese mythological tradition encoded the fundamental arithmetic of human existence. We lose people, but we make more. Izanagi then placed a great boulder, the Chigeshi no Okami, the god of returning, across the mouth of the Yomi entrance, sealing the boundary between the living and the dead with divine permanence. And Izanami, speaking from behind the boulder in a voice that was now fully the voice of death, told him, "I will haunt this boundary forever." She became Izanami no Mikoto, the great deity of Yomi, the ruler of the underworld, the goddess of death, the force that claims every living thing in its time. The wife had become the enemy. The co-creator had become the devourer. Izanagi emerged from the cave into the living world and immediately performed the most important purification ritual in all of Japanese religious practice. He found a river, the Ahaji no Shima River, and immersed himself in it, washing away the contamination of Yomi. From the objects he removed and cast into the water, new gods were born. From the washing of his left eye came Amaterasu, the great deity of the sun. From the washing of his right eye came Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon. From the washing of his nose came Susanoo, the god of storms. 3 children born from purification, each one governing one of the 3 great domains of the visible sky. But the purification ritual at the river contains a detail that almost no Western account of this myth includes, a detail preserved in specific Shinto ritual practice that reveals something extraordinary about what Izanagi actually brought back from Yomi. Not corruption, not death contamination in the simple sense. Something far more specific, a piece of knowledge about the nature of the underworld that he encoded, deliberately, into the purification ritual itself. And the ritual that millions of Japanese people still perform today, in modified form, contains that knowledge, hidden in the gestures and the words, waiting to be decoded. From the purification of a single body emerging from the land of the dead, 3 of the most important deities in the entire Japanese pantheon were born simultaneously. This is the Japanese mythological tradition, at its most architecturally sophisticated. The most fundamental forces of the visible world, sunlight, moonlight, and storm, created not from deliberate divine action, but as the byproduct of purification. Not planned, not intended. Born from the act of washing away death. Which suggests, in the deepest theological layer of this myth, that the great forces governing the visible world are, at their origin, responses to mortality. Amaterasu, the great heaven-illuminating deity, the goddess of the sun, emerged from the washing of Izanagi's left eye and was immediately recognized as the greatest of his children. Izanagi gave her the necklace of jewels he wore, the Yasakani no Magatama, one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, and charged her with ruling the high plane of heaven. In the Japanese tradition, Amaterasu is not simply a sun goddess in the way that other cultures have sun gods. She is the supreme deity of the Japanese cosmos, the ancestor of the imperial family, the source of the divine mandate that authorized Japanese kingship for over 2,000 years. Tsukuyomi, the moon reader, the god of the moon, emerged from the washing of the right eye and was charged with ruling the realm of night. His story in the mythology is briefer and darker than his sisters. In a story that the Nihon Shoki preserves with startling specificity, Tsukuyomi killed the food goddess Ukamochi in a dispute over the manner in which she prepared his meal, and Amaterasu, horrified by her brother's violence, declared that she would never look at him again. This is the mythological explanation for why the sun and moon never occupy the sky at the same time. They are estranged siblings, separated by a murder that could not be forgiven. Susanoo, the impetuous male, the god of storms, emerged from the washing of Izanagi's nose and was charged with ruling the seas. He is the most complex and contradictory figure in the Japanese pantheon, a destroyer and a hero, a god who weeps so loudly and so persistently that mountains crumble and seas dry up, who is banished from heaven for his violence and chaos, who then descends to earth and performs the greatest act of heroism in Japanese mythology, the slaying of the 8-headed dragon Yamata-no-Orochi, and the discovery of the divine sword Kusanagi within its tail. Susanoo is the Japanese mythological embodiment of the storm, terrifying, destructive, and ultimately the source of the greatest gifts. But the birth of these 3 children from purification has a consequence that the mainstream account of Japanese mythology consistently undersells. When Izanagi charged each child with their domain and distributed his divine possessions among them, he performed an act that had no precedent in the Japanese cosmos. He retired. The god who had created the world, who had descended into death and returned, who had washed the last traces of Yomi from his body, he withdrew. He went to a small, quiet realm and was never directly active in the mythology again. And the question of why the creator of the world chose obscurity over governance is answered only in a single, rarely translated passage from the oldest layer of the Kojiki. An answer that suggests Izanagi did not retire. He was waiting. The greatest crisis in all of Japanese mythology did not come from outside the divine order. It came from within it. It came from Susanoo, the storm god, Amaterasu's younger brother, and his inability to accept the world as it was. His grief for his dead mother Izanami was so powerful, so all-consuming, so cosmically disruptive, that the mountains he walked on dried up, and the rivers he passed over went silent, and the oceans he governed rose in storms that had no end. His weeping was not human weeping. It was divine weeping, the weeping of a god whose grief made the world wrong. Izanagi, exhausted and unable to console his storm son, banished him. He sent Susanoo away from the divine realm, away from his charge over the seas, out of the divine family's presence. And Susanoo, before leaving, decided to go to heaven to say goodbye to his sister Amaterasu. What should have been a farewell became a catastrophe. Amaterasu, suspicious of her brother's motivations, knowing his violence, knowing his chaos, knowing that the last time a god had descended from heaven with the declared intention of visiting a realm, it had ended in the creation of the world, prepared for war. She met him armed, her hair unbound like a warrior, her quiver heavy with arrows. What followed was a contest between siblings that began as a test of divine intention and ended in destruction. Susanoo swore his intentions were peaceful. Amaterasu tested him with a divine exchange of creative power. They each took objects from the other and breathed life into them, creating new gods from each other's possessions. The gods born from Amaterasu's objects were male. The gods born from Susanoo's objects were female. And the interpretation of whose gods were whose, which of them had truly won the creative exchange, became the source of the conflict. Emboldened by his interpretation of victory, Susanoo's behavior deteriorated. He destroyed the rice paddies his sister had carefully cultivated in heaven. He filled in the irrigation ditches. He defiled the sacred weaving hall where Amaterasu's divine weavers worked. And in the final, unforgivable act, the one that tipped the cosmos from crisis into catastrophe, one of the weavers, startled by Susanoo's violence, was killed by her own loom. The death happened in Amaterasu's sacred space, and Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, responded the only way a divine being in profound shock and grief can respond. She withdrew. She entered the cave. Ama-no-Iwato, the cave of heaven, a place so deep and so sealed that no light could escape it. She rolled a great boulder across the entrance and sat in the darkness. And the entire world went dark. Not just night dark, not storm dark, the specific darkness of a world from which the principle of light has been removed. Crops stopped growing. Evil spirits emerged in the darkness, moving through a world that had lost its organizing principle. The 8 million gods of the Japanese cosmos gathered outside the cave and did not know what to do. But what the 8 million gods eventually did to bring Amaterasu out of the cave is the most extraordinary piece of divine problem-solving in all of world mythology. They did not beg, they did not threaten, they did not try to force the boulder away. What they did was so unexpected, so counterintuitive, so completely outside of the behavior that a goddess in grief and righteous anger would expect that it worked. And what it tells us about the nature of the Japanese divine, about how the gods understand the relationship between sorrow and joy, between isolation and return, between the darkness we choose and the light that calls us back, is the deepest wisdom encoded in the entire Celestial Bridge mythology. The solution that the 8 million gods of heaven devised to bring Amaterasu out of the cave was, at its core, a party. Not a solemn ceremony, not a great sacrifice, not a display of power, a celebration. The gods decided to make Amaterasu curious. They decorated the sacred tree outside the cave with jewels and a great mirror. They positioned the cock, the roosting bird whose crow announces the dawn, on a branch above. And then a goddess named Ama-no-Ukihashi, the great persuader, the deity of dawn and festivity and the art of moving the unmovable, climbed onto an overturned bucket and began to dance. The dance of Ama-no-Ukihashi is the most famous and most analyzed moment in Japanese mythology. In its original form, as recorded in the Kojiki, it was ecstatic, transgressive, explicitly comedic, a divine burlesque that made the 8 million gods laugh so hard that the sound of their laughter shook the heavens. In a world that had gone dark, in a crisis that had stripped the cosmos of its light, 8 million gods laughed. And Amaterasu, sitting in her cave, in her grief and her righteous anger, surrounded by the darkness she had chosen, heard the laughter. And she could not understand it. Why were they laughing? How could they be laughing? The world was dark. The crops were dying. Evil spirits were moving through the unlit land. And the gods outside her cave were making a sound she had never heard before in quite this way. Not the laughter of celebration, not the laughter of relief, but the specific, helpless, uncontrollable laughter of beings who have encountered something so unexpected, so perfectly absurd, that their bodies simply cannot contain it. Amaterasu's curiosity overcame her grief. She opened the cave just slightly, just enough to look out and ask what was happening. In that moment, everything had been prepared for this exact sliver of opening. The god Ama-no-Ukihashi, the deity of physical strength, stood beside the cave entrance. The mirror had been positioned to catch whatever light emerged. And when Amaterasu looked out and the first ray of her divine light fell on the mirror and reflected back to her, showing her own luminous face, showing her own divine radiance, showing her what the world lost when she withdrew, she was transfixed. Long enough for Ama-no-Ukihashi to catch the boulder and throw it away. Long enough for the gods to pull her fully out of the cave. Long enough for the world to have its light back. The theology encoded in this moment is extraordinarily sophisticated. The gods did not restore the sun by force or by divine mandate. They restored it by reminding the sun of its own nature, by showing Amaterasu her own reflection and making her understand what her absence meant. The cure for divine withdrawal was not argument or power, it was joy. And the specific, transgressive, life-affirming joy of Amino-Uzume's dance, the refusal to let darkness be the last word, is one of the most enduring theological principles in the Shinto tradition. And here is the detail that changes everything. The mirror that was used to catch Amaterasu's light, the Yata no Kagami. The 8-span mirror was not made for this occasion. It was not crafted in the crisis. The divine chronicles record that it was forged specifically for this moment, but they do not record who ordered it to be forged or when. There is a single line in the oldest layer of the Nihon Shoki that suggests the mirror was commissioned before Susanoo ever descended from heaven, before the rice paddies were destroyed, before the weaver died, before Amaterasu entered the cave, which means someone in the divine assembly knew what was coming and prepared for it. And the question of who knew and how connects directly back to the floating bridge at the beginning of everything. The myth of the celestial bridge and the creation of Japan is not ancient history. It is living infrastructure. The theology encoded in the story of Izanagi and Izanami, of the descent into Yomi and the purification at the river, of Amaterasu and the cave. This is the foundation of Shinto, the indigenous religious tradition of Japan, which remains one of the most widely practiced religions in the world today. Every shrine in Japan, and there are over 80,000 of them, is, in its essential structure, a response to events described in this mythology. Every purification ritual, every festival, every offering. The 3 imperial treasures of Japan, the sword Kusanagi, the jewel Yasakani no Magatama, and the mirror Yata no Kagami, are the physical objects from this mythology. The sword found in the dragon's tail, the jewel that Izanagi gave Amaterasu, the mirror that caught the sun's light and brought the world back. These 3 objects are still held by the Imperial House of Japan, still considered the divine authorization of Japanese sovereignty, still used in imperial enthronement ceremonies. The mythology is not behind glass in a museum, it is in the throne room. The concept of misogi ritual purification through water, which Izanagi performed when he returned from Yomi, is still practiced in Shinto shrines throughout Japan. The specific acts of washing, the specific words spoken, the specific sequence of purification are all directly traceable to the moment Izanagi emerged from the cave at the edge of the underworld and immersed himself in the river. Every person who washes their hands and rinses their mouth at the Temizuya basin before entering a Shinto shrine is performing, in miniature, the purification ritual that created the sun, the moon, and the storm. The concept of kotodama, the power of words, the belief that spoken language has inherent divine energy that shapes reality, is built directly into the creation myth. The names Izanagi and Izanami spoke to create the islands were not descriptive. They were generative. The name was the thing. And this belief that the right word spoken in the right context with the right intention has real power over reality runs through Japanese poetry, Japanese ritual, Japanese political language, and the entire tradition of Shinto prayer. When a Shinto priest intones a noraito, a ritual invocation in front of a shrine, they are operating on exactly the same theological principle as Izanagi and Izanami, naming the islands from the floating bridge. But there is one legacy of the celestial bridge myth that never makes it into the tourist guides or the academic summaries, a legacy that is encoded not in a practice or an object, but in a specific configuration of the Japanese landscape. The ancient geography of Japan preserves, in the placement of certain sacred sites, a map that corresponds precisely to events in the creation myth. The locations are not symbolic, they are literal. And when you plot them on a map and connect them in the order described in the Kojiki, they form a pattern that a modern geologist would recognize immediately, a pattern that suggests the earliest Japanese mythographers were recording something real about the formation of their islands. Not metaphor, observation. The bridge between heaven and earth was not only a story, it was a map. We began at the edge of the world on a bridge of clouds and light suspended above the formless void. Two gods with a jeweled spear and an instruction that had never been given before. We end in the world that those two gods created, an archipelago of islands in the Pacific, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and continuity, a religious tradition that has maintained the memory of that original bridge for over 2,000 years. The story of Ama-no-Ukihashi, the floating bridge of heaven, is not at its deepest level a story about Japan. It is a story about the act of creation itself, about what it means to stand at the edge of what is and reach toward what could be, about the terror and the courage of making the first mark on the blank surface of existence, about the partnerships that creation requires and the tragedies that creation sometimes cannot avoid, about the way that mistakes, properly mourned and properly understood, become part of the fabric of the world, about the fact that even the gods, faced with the void, hesitated. The leech child and the foam island, the early mistakes, the imperfect first attempts were placed in boats and sent out to sea, but they did not disappear. They became the unexpected gifts, the god of fortune, the god of the unplanned encounter, the blessing that arrives from a direction you were not watching. The Japanese mythological tradition understood, from the very beginning of its cosmological imagination, that what gets sent away is not always gone. That what looks like failure might be creation working at a resolution too high for the original intention to perceive. Izanami is still in Yomi. The boundary between the living and the dead is still maintained by the boulder Izanagi placed at the cave entrance. Every day, 1,000 people die, and 1,500 are born. The arithmetic of the threshold still running, still balanced, still tipping just enough toward life to keep the world populated. Amaterasu is still in the sky, still illuminated by the memory of the mirror that showed her her own face. Susanoo is still in the storm, still carrying the grief that will not quiet, still capable of the destruction and the heroism that are equally his nature. And somewhere in the space between the ordered realm of the heavens and the churning potential of what has not yet been made, the floating bridge of heaven still stands, not as mythology, as possibility, as the place where every act of genuine creation begins, at the edge of the known, above the void, with a tool you've never used before, and an instruction you've never been given before, and the specific courage it takes to lower the spear into the chaos and stir. The bridge was never just between heaven and earth. It was between what is and what could be. And every human being who has ever made something new, who has ever stood at the edge of their own void and reached into it, has stood on that bridge. Before there was history, there were legends. And this legend has never ended, because the bridge has never come down. And so, as the jeweled spear is lifted one final time from the churning ocean of creation, and the islands of Japan take their shape in the morning light of the world's first sunrise, we leave you with the question the gods themselves once faced. If you were standing on the floating bridge, above the void, with the power to make something real, what would you create? Subscribe to Epic Legends. The ancient world is waiting, and the bridge is still there.